Robert. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. What a wonderful backdrop you have there.
Oh, I just got it laying around.
You're just laying around. If you center yourself just right, it looks like you have a glowing halo behind you. Where are you calling from today?
I'm at home. So it's my home studio, aka my shed.
Well, we do what we can with the spaces that we have. I'm super excited to talk to you about your solo exhibition for the Bureau Queer Art, which opens on October 4th in Mexico City and on Artsy on October the 1st. And you'll be doing a solo exhibition, and we'll be including you in our group exhibition for the magazine as well. I adore the work that you have. I love many things about it, but one of the things I really like is the way that it takes up space and it has all this weight to it. I'm excited to talk to you about the pieces that you're exhibiting with us. And I think maybe we'll just go and start with the most obvious one, right behind you right now.
Yeah, I think that's often been my effort is thinking about how big I can get. I mean, often you work to the size of the space you're given. Fibers gives you an opportunity to kind of fold and play with space in a very different way. Working in metal or something, you would be really confined to that space. Whereas as I'm working on this, I made this piece in this space, and it altogether it's about 50 pounds of wool, just alone, without the apparatus for hanging it. And it was an effort to see how big. It's actually smaller than I wanted it to be, of course. Uh, it's always the kind of goal is to figure out like how do I make something that occupies space and makes you feel a presence? And I've been thinking about that in a lot of different ways in my work. Uh, and the a straightforward way is just to make something that makes you aware of your own body when you're near it. It's like the old minimalist approach to thinking about sculpture is when suddenly you're confronted with something that's bigger than you, you suddenly have to pay attention to how you move around it.
Certainly changes the space that you're in. I'm curious a little bit about the process of your weaving. Are you using a specific technique? What kind of materials do you use?
So in most of the work, it's a combination of crochet or weaving, and usually floor loom weaving or digital jacquard weaving. This piece behind me is all crochet, and it's a series of a bunch of different. It's an interesting process. So it's all initially starts as raw wool, and then I crochet the raw wool instead of spinning it. I leave it kind of in long, unchanged kind of fiber, and I would split it to different thicknesses and I would create my own kind of rhythm. And so I started in the middle and spiraled my way out. Um, and kind of create my own process and just force myself to conform to it, like kind of a mathematic element of like I do a certain single crochet, a slip stitch, double crochet, and kind of follow a rhythm and see what happens to the piece as it expands. Um, and then once it's crocheted, then I wet felt it. And so initially I could have like teased it apart. I could do all kinds of things with it still when it's in its raw form, even though it's crocheted. But once I felt it, then it becomes really thick and kind of muscular and more like a skin. And that's kind of the combination of things that I'm looking at trying to achieve in the work. And then there's steel wool that's also mixed throughout it. In this piece, it's pretty minimal. Like you get these kind of color changes that are coming from the steel wool rusting from the wet felting process.
What
And
is wet felt?
wet felting, that's probably your most traditional type of felting. When you take wool and you kind of crisscross the fibers, and you get as hot of water as you can handle. Some people use a little bit of like Dawn dish soap or a little bit of soap, and you just start manipulating the fibers. You kind of press them, you roll them. Traditionally, you'll often see people with like a big mat, and they'll put the fibers in the mat and kind of roll it up like a sushi mat. And actually, if you're doing small scale, sushi mat works really well. You just kind of roll it, lean into it, and after usually 20 to 40 minutes, the material starts to really lock into itself. The heat causes the wool fibers to open up, and then the pressure causes them to kind of clasp into each other as they cool. It's kind of similar to paper making, but not quite the same. But it's a kind of a chaotic process. Um, And so that's one way I do it. With like a piece this big, I'll often use industrial wash machines. And that actually works really quickly. It agitates like crazy depending on the kind of machine it is. I'll often throw like tennis balls or something in with it, or towels, to force it to really kind of agitate, and as hot as the water can get. Uh, and I'm always interested in like ways of thinking about how technology is a part of the hand process and how it goes back and forth.
Sure, and I mean, exploring different ways of creating art with and without technology is really interesting in fiber arts because it's a very traditional area that could be considered more on the artisanal side of things. What for you transforms that into a fine arts?
I think it's true. I mean, I'm very interested and respect tradition, but it's not really been something that's informed my practice. I kind of got into art because it was something that I could create my own rules to. And a lot of traditional craft processes, you have like to know that you've done well in the process of making something, you conform to a process that someone else is probably developed. And you may have tweaked it and changed it to your needs, but there's kind of a conservation kind of element. You want to hold on to the history of how that thing was made. And that wasn't really how I got into fibers. My background getting into fibers is like through punk rock and DIY, and kind of just making it make sense. Yeah, like stitching like patches and stuff on clothes. And so I've learned that other kind of half, but mostly through like academics. I've learned through classes, like the history of a lot of the techniques that I have been kind of teaching myself for the most part.
I'm going to circle back to that punk rock statement and ask you how this develops from, sewing patches onto your clothing.
That's a good question. This specific process is something that I learned in grad school, where, I mean, not exactly this, but the idea of taking a fibers process and doing something and then actually doing another fiber process on top of it. I learned that from a professor at the University of Oregon who would do this mostly with dye processes. And so they would crochet string and then dye them and then take them uncrochet them, and you would get this really incredible, hard to predict kind of pattern and then weave with those string. And so it was just a way of setting up and thinking about, well, all these processes can be connected and tethered in really interesting ways. Going back to like punk rock, I mean, there's like two different, I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit, how many different directions people kind of enter the field of textiles or fibers or a lot of crafts, but especially fibers. There's like three main ways, and I feel like all three have kind of affected me. But one is like a very DIY. Growing up in the 90s, you get things like Stitch and Bitch become really popular. And so a lot of knitting and crocheting becomes really accessible. And also because of the internet at the same time, you get like websites like Ravelry.com that are giving away free patterns, and you're really opening up and making craft accessible to a lot of different people who I think like part of the punk rock DIY element of it is like I'm not going to buy my own clothes. I don't want to. I need to do everything's got to be kind of self-sustainable. I think there's drawbacks to that as well, but like that's part of it. Another element is often family. A lot of people learn how to do these techniques from different people in their family. Traditionally, like sewing, I learned how to crochet from my grandmother, and that was kind of like the gateway drug of fibers for me. Beyond like stitching and not really knowing what I'm doing, learning how to crochet with from her and then do something totally wrong in her eyes. And then, what she does and she looks at what I do, and we have that kind of bond, was pretty incredible. And I wouldn't have really predicted that would have been the direction I would have gone at the time. It was mostly just something I was playing around with.
That traditional sort of entry point is really important within fiber art itself. And I'm curious, what is the story behind the piece that you have behind you right now?
So this piece comes from a series of work that I started in 2020. Um, this is like, of course, like right in the middle of pandemic before vaccines were available or were something that people knew was going to be something that was going to exist. And so we were all living online. And at that time, while I was online, I also discovered that I had cancer. So it was this really crazy moment where we're all separated from each other. And I suddenly like realized I've got a lot of hospital dates suddenly on my list of things to do that I had not anticipated. And I'd already been thinking about processes of rust and thinking about how fiber arts can be very ephemeral or performative, connecting them to music and action and movement, like the gesture of crocheting. Um, and so thinking about, okay, what happens if I start to rust something? I know if I let the rust just keep doing what it's going to do, it's going to eventually eat away at the material. It just won't last forever. So it's having to really confronting my own mortality was at 38 trying to figure this stuff out. And this it's actually is looking at a bunch of images of tumors and modeled it and thinking about kind of the shape, the kind of growth pattern, this notion of accumulation. A lot of people look at crochet in mathematic terms because you can do something called a hyperbolic stitch. You can do this kind of mimic growth patterns in nature. So I was thinking about, well, okay, if think about this, well, what can my inspiration be? How do I take something from that diagnosis and turn it into something that could be viewed as being beautiful? How can I kind of put that on its head and think about, okay, what has happened to me is what's happened to me, and now I need to make sense of it, and this is going to help me kind of process that. And so this is
That's
the
really
last of those pieces, but
well. I mean, that's a really beautiful way to take something that would be terrifying in any circumstance, but then to have it happen during a pandemic and quarantines when you have to go to the one place that most people would not want to go to at that time. So did the process of creating this also help you address that anxiety and fear that comes up from any severe diagnosis like that?
yeah, it's those moments where you start to like realize like what kind of control you really have in life. And I think that's
Mhm.
another like that element when you're working in fibers or like clay or a lot of craft materials, you can really immediately see, okay, I put this kind of effort into this thing and I've transformed it. I have a control in a way over that. And so that's one of the things that becomes one of the things like something you grab onto. Because in that during that time, it felt like no one had control over anything that was happening in life. Um,
Sure.
and so
And you
that
also
became
like
something.
well, and I mean, you also use fiber arts in performance, which is, I think, is also like sort of a punk rock throwback, but also another way of processing through things. Can you talk a little bit about the performance piece that we're showing and the outcomes of it?
Yeah, that's one of the more recent series of work coming from that. That was just from this past May. And that's kind of a further extension of this body of work, and that the performers are all wearing crocheted forms, very not too dissimilar to this, that are in the process of being rusted. And through that work, I was thinking about kind of further steps of one, thinking about what does it mean to wear something that's like tumor-esque, something that can be worn in that kind of space, having to address the body. That's one thing I've always wanted to do is think about, I mean, not necessarily costuming, but thinking about how a body has to interact with these kind of objects. Uh, and then another element of it is that we collaborated remotely through the process of developing that work. All the performers that were in that piece, inside of one of the performers lives in different cities and even in different states. And so we worked via meeting on like through a Zoom and just talked about ideas behind the work. And from the impetus for the work was really thinking about how do we reconcile and accept rather than fighting um, and kind of sit in that anxiety and think about what anxiety actually does for us. How is it something that is actually part of our survival? Um, because that's, I mean, I often through like working in education had a lot of conversations about how kids were learning all these skills about resiliency, and I wasn't seeing that at all. And I was like, wait, well, what does it actually mean to really leave yourself in a space of resiliency? You have to actually take on things. And so we collaborated without really knowing exactly what was going to happen in the performance. And the day of was the only time we rehearsed. And it gave the performers some ideas for kind of movement they could think about, all based off of exercises that cancer survivors are suggested to experience after they've gone through surgery or through chemo. And so kind of thinking a lot about breath, stretching, and kind of slow movement. Uh, and then I created a sound piece that they would move to. And so I created that initially, sent it to them, and let them think about how they wanted to move in that space in relationship to it. And the sound piece is all built off of recordings of weird sounds from my own body, like the heartbeat, breath, um, like pulling, like the kind of stomach gurgling kind of sounds. All those sounds became kind of an atmospheric element to the soundscape, and then building sculptures that had speakers in them. Uh, I've That's been one thing I've been really trying to push myself to figure out how to merge those elements of technology into the fibers.
And how did you choose your collaborators, and what was the experience like of that performance? That basically not the traditional form of a performance, which would be rehearsed over and over and over again. I mean, it's somewhat similar to like cancer treatment in a sense, because you have like this kind of format that you're going to go through, but you have to let go of the outcomes of it.
That was, yeah, that was the most appealing thing to me, is like I don't know exactly what they're gonna do. I don't actually, in a lot of ways, I didn't want to know too much. I wanted to know that they felt comfortable and that they had a feeling that they knew how they were gonna progress through the piece. Um, but being able to let go, I mean, that's part of why I'm interested in working in dye processes and felting. I love, like, I have a sense of how things will go, but then I don't know exactly what it'll turn out to be. Um, and I think the three of the performers had known each other. And so one of the performers uh, is a professor of dance, and two of the other ones are former students. And then there was one performer that I had met actually because they do a lot of performance work with wool and felting. And I just happened to meet them luckily earlier that year. And it was really, really surprising that worked out. It could have gone a lot of crazy directions, but all of them, I think their energies clicked in a certain way, and it all made sense for them to work together. Uh, Part of the piece that I wanted to kind of have some sense of what was going to happen that wasn't totally improvised was towards the end of the piece. There's a section of felt that I wanted them all to hold on to and kind of pull against. Because I've been researching a lot of Irish and Scottish music, and there's something called a walking song, which is a process of felting. It's actually really breaking down woven wool to make it less scratchy. And it's a lot of kind of rhythm and music that's embedded within fibercraft. And I've been researching the different elements of that. And so I knew I wanted at one moment for them to all kind of pass this wool around together, but then also struggle against each other and kind of fight over the wool. And I was thinking about kind of what does the notion of community be? How does that exist? And thinking about community in relationship to cancer survivors, because it's, I mean, it's a weird way to say it. Like, you're very thankful that that community exists, but you never want to be a part of it. And so there's a really weird tension in that kind of space. And then also just thinking about where all this work kind of came from in a time where notion of community was like what we're doing right now. We're chatting via online, and you kind of forget what other people feel like, or how their space feels when they're next to you. Yeah.
And one of the other pieces, artifact, is very interesting because I see the sort of staining. I'm assuming that maybe the steel wool still being used throughout. Can you talk a little bit about that particular piece as well?
So those pieces, similar to the piece behind me, are all designed based off of cancer scars. And so the imagery you're seeing are cancer scars that I've redrawn and then turned into a digital file that I wove on a digital jacquard. And I mixed in steel wool and steel wire. And again, it started out as raw wool, and then I wet felt it. And when I wet felt it, it changes the shape, kind of takes the weaving out a little bit, and kind of makes it more like a skin, because the wool fibers start to bond, and you start to lose the kind of distance that a warp and weft leave between the space. It kind of closes the gaps of the weaving. and then it starts the rust process with the steel that's embedded in it. Um, and then over time, it starts to shift and change colors pretty dramatically. Like one of the first ones I did looks very different than the last one, and I often will work in a large series. So there's about 4 of those are made, and about 13 ready to be made beyond that.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, it's always nice to have a calandal of projects ahead of you. Are you planning on doing any shows outside of the one that we're working on you with, or?
Let's see, I just wrapped up one here in town where I live in the Shenandoah Valley. That was part of a residency. It's kind of the last bit of the series of this work, I think. Maybe, probably not, but uh, it's thinking about interaction in relationship to the rust. And so part of the rusting process is pretty inert. It just is going to kind of do its own thing. And I've been thinking about, well, how do we encourage it and actually push it even further? And how does interaction actually start to cause the rust? So I've been working with, again, felting, not crochet or weaving so much, more straight kind of felting processes, and using steel woolen and using a needle felter to put inlay of steel woolen that will work as a circuit. And so I'm also thinking about things like crackle boxes where you have to touch an object and you insert yourself into the circuitry of it to create the sound. And so I've been working through some pieces that people have to touch to get them to activate. So I'm really thinking about how do you lean into the idea of engaging and causing the rust to happen. So when people touch the steel wool, they'll be leaving probably oil, salt, water from their hands, and their hands are actually going to be the thing that cause it to start to rust and change color. And then another part of it that I find really beautiful is eventually they'll destroy the circuitry. And so they're going to actually start corroding its ability to perform. And so through your interaction, you're kind of forcing it to start to lose its ability to be interactive.
That's
And
really beautiful. I mean, it's a great metaphor for community, but also for recovery as well, because the object isn't the most important thing in this instance, maybe the disease itself, but it's the way people are interacting with it and the way that you are exploring the release of that as well. So
yeah, I think part of how I came into working in fibers was thinking pretty expansively about what ephemerality means. Um, I always like it. There's always the cliche of people saying like tattoos are forever. And in my mind was like, oh, I'm not forever. Like I like tattoos are the most ephemeral art form there is because they're really gonna go away. Um, and so I just those things become really interesting to me and thinking about how fibers just doesn't have, even in really great like oxygen completely reduced spaces, they just don't last very long. Part of that comes from researching textiles in Central and South America and looking at things like ipu, these knot tying processes, and then researching the kind of history of why there's so few of them now and how are like people re-embracing the kipu, um, and realizing, well, that's just something from 500 years ago in textiles is going to go away. And then like just the beauty of a kipu, like to be able to read them, to read the knots, you have to move them, you have to touch them. If you're going to touch them, you're going to destroy them. And so like that really interesting kind of disconnect. I mean, maybe it's not really disconnect, but a dissonance of like, well, I really want to know what this says, but it means I'm going to have to kind of destroy it in the process.
right, and I think that's a really important concept within ephemera and life is that things grow and then they decay and they become something else. So very, very, very powerful metaphor used within your work. I appreciate that very much. And I know that you're on sabbatical right now from your job within a college. Can you close up with us today talking about like the things that you're learning in your sabbatical and how you've been using your time?
That's yeah, part of the work and thinking about how to create like a sculptural form that has its own lifespan. Continuing to think about, well, what so these things have their own life in the sense that they're not going to be made out of stone. They're going to live probably a little bit longer than I do, but not a super long time. But I was like, well, what else do living things do? They don't just die. They communicate. They do something. They interact. They have conversations with people, and so that's been part of thinking about how interaction works within the piece. How does a person have to engage with the object, and they leave their impression on it, and it leaves its impression on them. And then also thinking about like, well, what happens if the object itself is the thing that creates the sound? And so I've been trying to get away from using like speakers, your traditional kind of paper speakers, and experimenting with turning the felt itself into a speaker form. And so as the felt's got like steel wool embedded in it, it's going to start to decay, it changes colors. But then if it's the thing that's vibrating like a drum head, it's actually the thing that's the membrane that's speaking to us. And eventually it's not going to be able to talk because it's going to it'll shake itself apart through, and eventually means probably 100 years. But eventually it just won't be able to do what it's trying to do. And I just find that to be another incredible metaphor for what it means to exist. But so that's really the direction right now that it's going into. Doing even more research into anthropology and archaeology. Like 20 years ago, there's no way I would have ever said that's something I'm super interested in. Like from a punk rock aesthetic, like whatever's new and most exciting, that's what I ought to be doing. And now I'm looking at things that are as old as I could find, like 3,000-year-old petroglyphs in Ireland to find meaning and think about like, well, what does it mean what's a petroglyph if my body is the thing that we're researching instead of a cave? Like, what are those kinds of things that are left on me?
It's really beautiful. I mean, it's a great way to celebrate, but also to I think maybe even have gratitude for life as well, through that acceptance of the temporal qualities of things and using these materials, knowing that they're not going to be 100% archival, right? Very controversial in the art world to be purchasing things that aren't going to exist. It's like an acceptance. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us from your studio today.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.